Welcome. Thank you for coming here on Friday afternoon. And this is one of the conversations that Graduate Program in International Affairs has in relations to media and international affairs. My name is Nina Khrushcheva. I'm a professor at the International Affairs Program, and I invited Sean Jacobs to join me to ask questions of James Hoge, since Sean is a direct chair of the concentration, GPIA concentration. James Hoge, our honored guest, absolutely, is an editor of Foreign Affairs, and I brought Foreign Affairs, not that it needs any introduction, and neither does James, and still let me say a few words. He's been great editor of Foreign Affairs in the last 18 years, and I remember when I was a graduate student at Princeton, only very foreign policy-oriented people, high-level thinkers were reading Foreign Affairs at the time, and I think what James was able to do in this 18 years is that now it's being read by people like Henry Kissinger and my students, so it's really quite a range of readers here. And actually, I think a few months ago, I asked James if he thinks that Dick Cheney reads Foreign Affairs, and I don't know. I don't think we came up with an answer. Does he?
I'll give you an answer to two parts of it. Henry Kissinger is mad at me, so he doesn't read this anymore.
Oh, okay, sorry.
And that has to do with the Chilean story, which if you want to, we can get into later. Dick Cheney does read us and got mad at me because I ran a lead piece by Clayton Powell. That was back when they were both in office, and it gave you an early indication that they weren't exactly on the same wavelength.
So actually, I was wrong. Dick Cheney does, and Henry Kissinger doesn't. So prior to joining Foreign Affairs, James spent 3 decades in journalism in Washington, was a publisher and journalist, Chicago Sun-Times, then was a publisher and president of the New York Daily News, fellow at Harvard Johns Kennedy School of Government, Freedom Forum Media Center at Columbia, and so on and so forth. And on just a little personal note, when I met James first, I think it was about 10 years ago. Yes, it was, exactly. It was one of those international conferences. He was both a speaker and a moderator of a panel, and I was admiring his capacity to do both. And I must say that since then, I've been absolutely marveled at his integrity and great professionalism at anything he does, which is writing, moderating panels, commenting on foreign affairs all over the world. So he's really has been a really very great role model. As for logistics, so we will have question and answers. So Sean and I ask James a few questions for about 50 minutes, and then we'll turn it to the audience. We'll finish at 5:30 sharp, and then we'll have a little reception afterwards, and everybody's invited. Thank you. So, okay. Let me start with the big story that has been going on, sort of the nuclear spring, as they say. What is your assessment of the nuclear summit with the agreement with the Russians that's been signed, with the possibility that the Chinese may support sanctions against Iran and whatnot? So is this spring, you think, going to last?
I'm not sure it's even started.
Oh.
It is, if it has, it's a very laudable but small step in many respects. Let's take the Iranian part of it first and foremost. I think we may get, quote, cooperation from Russia and perhaps from China on a new round of sanctions. But they're not likely to be foolproof. They're going to have exits for those who don't really want to have to perform under their constraints. And the track record of the past, unless the past is not prologue for once, is that the Russians and the Chinese, when they do go along with sanctions, they violate them as their needs require. Now, both of them have major commercial operations going in Iran, which are very valuable to them. But in addition to that, I don't think that alone explains their behavior. They have a different view of what the threat is and who the threat is directed towards. In their view, it's directed towards us, not towards them, and that it is less definitive than we take it to be, that the nuclear program in Iran is much more stretched out, is probably something that's not going to be critical, if indeed they are aiming for nuclear weapons for another 4 to 5 years. There are different estimates you can get. That it's not theirs alone. In Europe, you'll find the same timetable. So they don't have the same sense of urgency, but they're also not a close ally of Israel, and so they are not as prone to action by considerations involving Israel. And the big consideration involving Israel and Iran is Israel under the Netanyahu government had made it very clear that they cannot stand aside if Iran reaches that point in which they have the capabilities for making nuclear weapons. Does that mean they will create a military strike? We do not know. Can we stop them? Another question that is not fully answerable. But it is a consideration that we have. How are we to relate to Israel in the confrontation with Iran that that Russia, excuse me, that was a while ago, wasn't it? Russia and the Chinese do not have the same kind of factor impugning upon their decision. As for the agreement that's been made, let's understand it's a very good thing to move towards a lockup, as it's called, of nuclear fission materials. To make one that is uniform and not breakable is an impossibility. It's not going to happen. So taken alone, that step doesn't get you to where you want to be, which is a significant reduction in the possible threats or mishandling of nuclear capabilities. You have to do many other things, which we can get into if you'd like.
Okay, let me ask you sort of a follow-up question on the other part of the world that we mentioned, China. There was an article that you wrote in Foreign Affairs in 2004, Global Shift in the Making, in regard to Asia, and actually I think I have a couple of copies out there. And so what you were talking about is that the Asian strength or growing strength is being recognized, but it's also not translated into preparedness of the United States to into certain policy decisions or coherent policy decisions. And so I'm wondering if that has changed in the last 6 years since you wrote that piece.
Yeah, I wasn't the first, but I was one of the early ones to sort of raise the signal that there was a historic transformation underway of a dimension that rarely comes along in history, which is to say a real reorientation of the international order of power. And this time around, what we are looking at, and I wrote this in, as you say, 2004, is a shift of every kind of power you can think of, military ultimately, economic, culturally, demographically, from the West to the East. And the international order in the future, one way or another, is going to have a much bigger role at every level, top level, middle level countries, and so on, of non-Western countries. So in the first time in 500 years or so, we are seeing the levers of management of the international system having to be shared, indeed, if not actually led by Eastern, non-Western societies. And in that piece, I had said that the United States was so preoccupied with some of its short-term problems, including 2 wars and the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and domestic problems that were left over from how much we had to spend on the Cold War against the Soviet Union, which then did exist, that our awareness was coming that this shift was underway. But our approach in terms of policy was lagging. And that could lead to some very dangerous situations, because the last time we had a major shift in sort of the power configuration of the international order was from the 19th to the 20th century, when the rising or aspiring powers were Germany and Japan. And the international system of that time was not of a mind to accommodate them into leadership positions, and vice versa. The aspiring powers were coming in a rather belligerent way, and they were autocratic powers. And so we ended up with a major power conflict that came twice, World War I, World War II. There are other reasons for those, but this was one of them. The Chinese profess these days to have read their history, to understand what went wrong, that they don't want this kind of confrontation again, and so they've come up with the concept of peaceful rising. And for the most part, so far, that seems to be working. And our response to that has been twofold. One is a very public one, which is that the right relationship between us and China, which is the hegemon of East Asia from here on in, barring something different happening, the right relationship is one of engagement, which doesn't mean there won't be frictions or differences, but you will be striving all the time to accommodate each other to a certain extent so you have a win-win situation, and someone doesn't have the need to go outside of the international order and start something wholly new and conflictual. There is a second American foreign policy, though, which you might call hedging your bets. Quietly and without raising alarms, we have been busily trying to strengthen a whole archipelago of relationships around China. Japan at one end, going through South Korea and Japan at one end, going through Taiwan, as long as it's a separate entity, through the Philippines, Indonesia, and all the way up to India. Now, nobody has, that I know of, seriously, considers containing China to be a feasible objective, even if it was a good one. But constraining them is a different kind of concept. Constraining them means we can help both by engagement and both by certain borders or pressures against them to constrain their activities and the way they play their role into something that's more constructive and more amenable to us than otherwise would be the case. And also, with that archipelago of alliances, so to speak, of relationships, it is in itself a soft deterrent. It sort of says, don't get too belligerent in trying to get your aim here or there, because you have this to worry about. And if all those countries were to turn against you, you've got a problem, China. So I guess my answer is, it has changed in that we are now in a position to pay more attention to it, we are more aware of it, and we've had a consistent policy to China now for several administrations, Republican and Democratic. And I think that's a good thing. I happen to think that the broad outlines of our sort of two-level policy are about right. Implementation is another question, and no power, including our own, ever gets implementation right all the time. And the other thing is, which is a historical unknowable, there are some international relations scholars who will tell you, you simply don't get a power shift of this dimension without conflict at some point. That no matter how amenable someone seems, if they're the aspiring power, at some point they're going to want to grab more than you want to give. Well, I don't see that as an immediate problem. I think it's something to keep on your mind as we go forward.
This is my last question, and then I will turn to Sean to follow up on what you just said. There've been, I think, a week-long series on CNN on rising China and what does it mean for the United States. And actually, it was the first time it was addressed in a sort of broader, general media form of what it might mean. But parts of those parts of the story were about the fact that it may be that China was booming so quickly that the collapse is inevitable, and there's maybe housing boom, which, the housing boom may collapse and whatnot. And what I wonder is that actually in your article you already suggested that there is a possibility, and I wonder how that, do you see that still is a possibility, first of all? And second of all, what is the effects of the crisis, the global crisis, and how would China play out in that
Okay.
formula?
Let me answer it in two parts. First of all, China's role internationally or on the global scale has been speeded up. The Chinese leaders that I talked to and when I traveled there all had laid out sort of a scenario which said, look, we really do want another decade or two to work almost exclusively on our domestic situation, strengthening the country, creating a more productive, prosperous and secure China. And we want to stay out of playing any leadership role that we don't have to play for our own national interests on the international scene. Along comes the Great Recession, and in the eyes of lots of Chinese, the collapse of the United States as to a much lower level of power and influence in the international world. Vacuums were being created, opportunities were being created, and they have moved in some respects faster on the international scene. Second part is what's going on inside China. Yes, and 6 years ago, or whatever it was, 2004, I alluded to the fact that they have some very, very large problems that are developing because of their development. Now, I would say this, first of all, they had very, very large problems the last 25 years, and more than most national leadership groups, they prevailed and had more successes than defeats or deficits, if you will. But the problems coming up may be significantly bigger than they were. And also history pretty much tells us that the progress of nations is never linear, and you cannot predict everything that's going to happen to you or by you. Right now, and I won't go into the details, but China has a major demographic problem. It has a major environmental problem, which is not just for good people who want things to be pretty and green. It's so serious that they attribute some 500,000 deaths a year directly to air pollution. The major cities on the coast are bad enough, but if you go inside China, into the back provinces, you will not believe the atmosphere in some of the urban cities that now number well over 1 million people each. They've got 100 cities or more of over 1 million people. So China is likely to have some setbacks. They also have a population which at this point, at the middle class level, and they have developed a middle class, is going along more than not with the leadership group because they're getting so much materialistic progress. But a middle class, as we all know, can be terribly dynamic when they get the things they want and they can't get them. And that's usually soft things like the freedom to speak, the freedom to associate, the freedom to make different choices politically. China is not there yet, but there'll be a real exception historically if they don't get there at some point. The other problem they have is that's the middle class that's reasonably satisfied at this point. Below it is a working class that is very large in numbers and getting very dissatisfied for very specific reasons, not being paid for the work they do, being the primary victims of environmental pollution. And lastly, working conditions, even when they do get paid, that are horrific. They're now, and these are Chinese estimates, these are not sort of intelligence estimates from outside. There's approximately 100,000 demonstrations every year now, and particularly in the urban areas like Manchuria and some of the inner provinces. And when I say demonstrations, I don't mean one or two guys standing on the street corner with a flag and waving it. I mean mass numbers. One thing that has protected China so far from that being a really difficult problem to handle is that they have kept these demonstrations isolated from each other. There is not at the moment in China a mass sort of uprooting or politically change-minded movement in China. When that happens, if it does happen, who knows what's going to happen? The Chinese leadership, and again, given their history, goes to bed every single night asking themselves, are we getting close to the point where we have to deal with chaos again? Chinese chaos is not like other people's. It is enormous, and it is bloody, and it is very difficult to control. And so a lot of the times when you see them going through these curved ways of behavior, 3 or 4 months they'll be relatively tolerant of a pugnacious press and some dissidents filing human rights suits. And then another 3 months they'll close it all down. I've had this happen to me time and again with Foreign Affairs magazine. For over 10 years, longer than I've known Nina, I have been trying to get a Chinese language edition. We have other foreign language editions now. Every time I get this close, their eyes glaze, and essentially the message is, don't call us, we'll call you. And what is happening, it isn't specific to us, is they're going into another one of their crackdown periods. So what looks like a very stable environment isn't that stable. I don't mean to suggest that it's coming apart at the seams or that it's revolutionary at this point, but there are various indicators one ought to watch, because in some respects, there is a very small minority of a one-party system sitting on top of a population of over 1 billion people, and keeping that all going in the right direction that allows them to stay in power, and for the others to benefit as well, is a hat trick, if you will. I would just add this as a footnote. I think anything we can do to assist the further evolution and development of China, we should really do, because a China that is breaking apart is far, far more dangerous than one that is becoming, at least under the way they see the world now, a China that's becoming more prosperous and more secure is really not a direct and, you might say, existential threat to the United States as far as I see it. A China that is fearful and is paranoid and is nationalistic, and all of these trends, by the way, are there in China today, is a danger.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I want to also add my pleasure to have James here today. Before I sort of change the subject to talk a little bit more about media, I was just wondering what you think of the elections in Britain and, the possibility of a Cameron victory and what that would mean both for Britain's role internationally and its relationship with the United States.
Well, unless there's a surprise, it looks like there's going to be a very close election, which, whether in full flower or close, is going to give us a hung parliament, which means probably not much of anything in terms of bold moves that's going to happen. In terms of international relations, it's kind of like the United States to Britain. There are some differences between Democrats and Republicans, but they are marginal, really, in terms of our relationship with Great Britain, and vice versa. The Labour Party under Tony Blair, if anything, went more Thatcherite in the relationships with us than she ever dared do. So I don't see some great shift. The one that ought to concern us the most, there is within the in the Tory party, there is this shift between those who think in one way or another England has to be a part of Europe, of the European Union, and those who say, no, we should stand aside, we're still a separate entity and power unto ourselves. We should be a little concerned about that, because I think in the long term, when we look at this shift in power configuration on the global level, the United States to be able to compete against a fully prosperous China and a fully prosperous, or really increasingly prosperous, India and Indonesia not too far off, is going to have sort of more bulk than it's got on its own. And the natural bulk is the Atlantic Alliance, which we've all been kind of dissing of late because we say the Europeans have gotten passive and they don't pay attention and whatnot else. But if you take the economic and the demographic grouping we're talking about, the European Union plus the United States and Canada, you're looking at something that is of the same fighting weight, if you will, as the big non-Western powers that are coming to be. And I think that's important, again, for stability in the world. So I would hope that if the Tories do come to power, one, they can mute that element within their internal party matters, and gradually be brought around to the idea that they can't remain as special as they would like to. They're simply not big enough, they're not important enough, and they are needed as part of Europe, and then Europe as a part of a transatlantic relationship that's confronting the world in trade and the management of global problems like terrorism, environment, and so on, as these other great entities that are emerging.
Okay, so let me turn to the media then. I mean, of course, it's well known now that you wrote an article in 1997 called "Foreign Affairs."
My article is catching up with me.
Yeah, who gives a damn? And if people remember, you argued there that for various reasons, either the appetite for news or on the part of American audiences, readers, or economics on the part of, editors. Do you think, and then of course 9/11 happened, do you think that things are different? And of course there's also technology, or do you think there are aspects of that politics or that relationship that's still the same?
No, I think there are some changes. I wouldn't dismiss them as much as to say they're marginal, but they are gradual. And that, I may be wrong, but cultural changes don't happen very fast unless there's something very dramatic like a major war. They usually slowly change. The United States has a very long history of having the benefit, if you will, or of being very parochial. We've had two benign nations north and south of us. We've had these two huge oceans. We've had a country to develop of our own, the frontier and all that. And we were dragged into the problems of the world to start with. That still has great effect within how average Americans think about the world. Okay, maybe we have to be engaged, but we don't enjoy it. And where we're engaged, we like to keep it economic as much as possible. But what happened with 9/11 was, in some respects, a real historical break for the United States. Suddenly, two oceans aren't protecting you, two benign powers, north and south, are not where the issue is. And it really did energize the public to know more. But then that brings us to something that's also been true for a long time, certainly the 50-odd years now that I've been involved in journalism, which is as far as international affairs are concerned, for the most part, the American public wants to elect people, anoint you and me to take care of it on a day-to-day basis. If we really screw up, then they want to have the right to throw us out and get somebody else. And that they only pay attention to international affairs with any kind of constancy or depth when the fear factor goes up. During the Cold War, remember the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist had its famous clock, and when the second hand got 5 minutes to midnight, it usually meant that a hell of a lot of the public was paying attention because suddenly we thought the Soviet Union was about to do something very dangerous. 9/11 did that again, but now it's been very quiet since, and I think there's been a diminution again of American interest in the world and feeling that they particularly have to have something to do with our relationship. They'd rather assign it to others, and if it isn't going well, change. It's not isolationism in the way that term is used when talking about the United States in the 20s and the early 30s. Most Americans understand that we have to be engaged in the world. Globalization has done that whether we like it or not. For economic reasons, above all others, we've got to be there. Even when globalization is creating some downside things to deal with, inequality and so forth, it's better than if it wasn't there at all. And besides, we can't make it go away. So, yes, it has changed. There is a greater awareness in the United States that there's an interconnectedness that cannot be avoided. But while it's not marginal, it's moderate and it's changing like this, it's nowhere near what Europeans are used to, which is if we aren't paying attention to the country that's only 100 miles away from us and another one that's 200 miles away from us and so on, we're risking real danger.
Before I turn it back to Nina again, I have one other question. So what do you think about the effect of things like blogs? Of course, as you point out, elites discuss foreign policy, so
Yeah.
for example, in foreign affairs. But there are now blogs, like specialist blogs, like say Juan Cole, who'll blog about Iraq, about the Middle East. Does that change things, or is it still very much these conversations?
Well, it may.
amongst the
It's hard to gauge at this point, but let me start it this way. Whatever the tools of communication have been for, say, the last 50 or 75 years, it's usually an aggregation of niches. It's not mass. And if you want to know something about X subject overseas, you can find a niche that will tell you. But what this also tells you is that the public is very fragmented in terms of how it pays attention to the world. And when it's fragmented, it doesn't have that much effect, except let's take an issue like immigration. Now, that's right next door. That's as much a domestic issue as an international issue. That one you can get fired up pretty quick. But on the whole, I don't think that new technology has changed the fact that foreign news availability is a set of niches, and that the public approaches it that way, that aggregating it to have a really mass effect on policymaking is very difficult to do. The old saw that the public leads the political establishment on domestic matters, tells them what really needs to be done, is exactly the reverse from foreign affairs, where particularly the president, if he has the bully pulpit and has the ability to affect the public, you should worry about this, you need to support me on that, these people are dangerous, and so on, much more than the public doing it to the leadership group. One way that the new technology is changing things rather dramatically, the advent of mobile instruments, particularly the mobile cameras on phones, has meant that you no longer can shut a place down entirely now, as Iran has found out. Secondly, if you are, let's say, we're a bunch of Democrats who want change and we're not getting it, we can get masses on the street like never before on short notice, and very difficult for opponents, for officials to stop it. So that's a kind of democratization of at least one aspect of international relations. And to a certain extent, it's empowering. It's telling lots of people who never thought they could have an effect before that maybe they can have effect. Unfortunately, it has the reverse effect as well. This new technology is very powerful to autocratic regimes in being able to find out who it is who's being dissident and when they're going to do it next, and therefore we're going to arrest an awful lot of people. So there's a yin and yang out there on the new technology. It both is empowering, particularly at a popular level, and at the same time, it is increasing the capabilities to clamp down, particularly on leadership groups of dissidents and insurgents and so on. School's out on what the ultimate effect is going to be.
But actually, I wanted to follow up on this question, if that's okay. In terms of leadership for foreign affairs now,
Right.
because if there's so much information, I mean, I understand it is fragmented, and that's why it's hard to present something as the final analytical word,
Right.
as the foreign affairs is supposedly final analytical word. But don't you worry about your audiences? It's being dispersed. Does it have other access now, rather than just pick up the
I
magazine?
have to disagree with the word final. We don't think anything we do or anybody else does is final, but
We think of it
we
that
hope
way.
we hope that for the moment in which it's done, it is reasonably authoritative, which is
We think of you that way, so.
Foreign affairs. First of all, when the Cold War ended, remember Francis Fukuyama came out with The End of History, which was not his title, but the thrust of the piece was, look, the main thing is going to happen from here on in. The wars of monarchs are over, the wars of ideology are over. So we're going to have an unfolding at various different speeds, depending on where, of liberal democracy and market economics around the globe. That's just when I was taking over the magazine in 1992. The New York Times, a famous memo at the time from the foreign editor, reduced the A section, the front section, by 2 full columns that had been devoted to foreign news, because they said not much is going to happen, nobody's interested anymore. Other publications began to shut down. Broadcasting said, we don't need all these expensive bureaus overseas. Today they have zero. And instead we're going to parachute people in on short notice, and they will stand there with their deep voices and sound very authoritative, and you won't know that they just got in 15 minutes ago and some kid who's the local had briefed them real quick, and they tell you what's going on. Then the newspapers got into the act, in part because of the financial restructuring that's going on in the business, and most newspaper foreign bureaus are now gone. The New York Times still has them, the Washington Post, some at the LA Times. That's about it. The mid-ranking papers that used to have very good people overseas, the Boston Globe, Dallas, Baltimore, Chicago, out of the business. I mention this because at that point was the same time in which, although nothing is supposedly happening internationally, foreign affairs circulation began to increase on a very steadily basis. It has increased without a break for 18 years. The economists had the same phenomena. The only way we could explain it, besides our own brilliance and what we're putting out, was that people in the attentive public not the general public, but the attentive public, which is an X million, were finding it increasingly difficult to get what they needed from a more popular or general press, and so they were coming to us. Now, online, is it a threat to a niche like foreign affairs? So far, not. We have our online operation, which we keep changing every year because it's a moving target right now. And it's immensely popular and has actually extended our voice, particularly overseas. There are parts of the world where distribution is very difficult of a magazine like ours. Latin America, for a while we said, gee, nobody in Latin America is interested. When we went online, suddenly there's a huge audience. So I would say it's very much a net plus. It doesn't substitute for us because a lot of people, particularly when you're talking about essays of 3 to 4 to 5, sometimes 6,000 words, they would like to have it in print. Now you can print off of online, but the magazine is still a very functional and effective transmission of information with this new edition of online. One last comment. Online, we have just a little box every day to say, if you'd like to subscribe to the print, just fill this in and send it to. We thought we'd get a handful here and there. We get a steady traffic of what is absolutely no cost circulation increases off of the web. So I'm a happy camper with the web.
Okay. Actually, yet again, a follow-up. So you mentioned that it was very difficult for you. You have various editions, global editions or
Right.
partner editions with foreign affairs. It was difficult to do it in China. What are other editions you have, and what are your most sort of influential, favorite? What are the ones that you use the most, if you use anything that coming in from
We
elsewhere?
have, our longest standing one is in Japan. Second is in Russia, and I'll come back to that. Then we have a Spanish language one, which was for all of Latin America. We did have an Indian edition, which was in English, but it was tailored specifically for the Indian market. That, thanks to the Great Recession, is on hold now. Our partner there got some problems. And the same thing with an Arabic edition. So those are two that have to be restarted once we're kind of out of the woods of what's going on now. The Russian edition is the most interesting one in a way. It was founded, we started it during the Yeltsin era. Putin comes in and increasingly starts cracking down on media and narrowing the boundaries on what's permissible and what you can say, who you can criticize, and so on. And nothing's happening to our Russian language edition. And we run some, I think, fair-minded but reasonably critical pieces about this aspect of that. And I called our Russian editor, it was a couple of years ago now, and I said, why aren't we getting pressure? Why aren't we getting a crackdown like everybody else? And he laughed and he said, look, Putin and the people around him understand that the intellectuals in Russia hate his guts anyway. And the only people who read our magazine are the intellectuals, so why bother? So they're going to save the ammunition for television and mass newspapers. It's probably true because we never have, every once in a while somebody like Lavrov, the foreign minister, will complain to me, but that's about it.
But there is no edition that you use. Do you use anything from those editions in foreign affairs? Here
Most of it's the other way around.
Okay.
And each edition is tailored for the regions and has a separate editor who uses pieces from the main foreign affairs that we think would be interesting in that region. They don't have to be specifically about the region, but they have to be interested to it. And we cut out a lot of stuff that maybe is too parochial, put all the book reviews because you can't get the books in a lot of these places. Coming the other way, occasionally I'll get a call from the editor in Russia saying, I have a piece I think would work for you system-wide. And usually he's right, and we've run several of those. And the same thing is true with the Spanish language edition. And that's really about it. We've never really had a reverse from Japan. I do have some of the people who write for the Japanese edition. I commission for the main edition, but then it's tailored for our general audience.
My last question, and then I will turn to Sean. It's sort of twofold. First of all, how the foreign policy debate and affected foreign affairs from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. It's probably maybe self-evident, but it's not really, because there could be various nuances there, and I'm curious. And another part of this question is that, how do you really decide what goes in?
Flip a coin.
Well, that simple?
No, not, I'm kidding, obviously. But on the first one, I get asked a lot, what influence do you really have? And my answer is this, that over time, most of the influence foreign affairs has on the actual policy making is incremental and sort of seeps down over a period of time. Occasionally, there will be an article that leads directly to policy changes. The most famous one, of course, is George Kennan's famous Mr. X article,
Well, this is 1946.
1947, which was the containment policy versus the Soviet Union. Since that time, we've had several that have had that same kind of direct influence, but not on the same scale. I mean, that was very, very unusual. Now, anecdotally, do we get paid attention to? It was a while ago, before both wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and before the confrontation with Iran, we were having our differences, U.S. versus, and we ran, not one, not two, we ran 3 articles over about 18 months on what we considered to be the bankruptcy of the dual containment policy at the time against Iran and Iraq, as if they were just 2 equal-sized players. And this is during the Clinton era, and I got a call from Hillary Clinton, who said, no, not, excuse me, not Hillary Clinton, from, I'm doing
Madeleine Albright.
Madeleine Albright. And we've known each other a long time. She called me up and she said, Jim, I want you to know something. We've read all 3 articles, and they were really very good. And we're not about to change policy, so you don't have to write a 4th one. So in other words, we don't always have much effect. On the larger question, we have 2 basic objectives in the magazine that go right back to its founding in 1922. It's in our credo. One is to try and influence the debate, make it more vigorous, more informed, not necessarily say exactly what it is that should be done, but to get it up to a higher level. But the second objective right from the beginning was to try and educate an important slice of the general public, let's call them those who help form opinion or trickle down. And we are as conscious of that as an objective as we are of being able to say, we've influenced policy itself. And in many respects, I think that second objective is the most important long-term. Because in a democracy, foreign policy can't really be exercised very effectively, particularly over time, unless there is a considerable amount of public understanding that leads to also some public support. In that sense, it is really fundamentally different than an authoritarian government. So getting an educated public that don't necessarily say what we tell them to say, but through the analysis of the pieces and the various different opinions that we run, may have a more considered and judicious effect on the policymaking community itself. One thing we're very careful about, we are nonpartisan. We have no affiliations with political parties or particular factions. The only bias we have, which is implicit, I think, we wouldn't be there otherwise, is that the United States has to be internationally engaged, that there is no choice on that matter, whether we're thinking about our own prosperity, our own security, or the betterness of the world as a whole. But how that gets implemented and what you mean by engagement is open for grabs all the time.
Just before I ask the question, what's our time like before we have to?
Well, we have about, I don't know, 10 minutes.
Okay. One of the sort of main issues of the 90s was the CNN effect, that CNN broadcast. What would be on CNN would then have some resonance among policymakers. Now you have other kind of global media players that are also entering the fray, like, Russia Today, or especially Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera. And recently I read this piece, which was a little sarcastic, by Robert Kaplan in the Atlantic Monthly, where he basically says everybody claims that global news is dead, or that nobody's watching global news, but actually Al Jazeera is doing all this work. What do you think of Al Jazeera and these places?
I don't see
that are
it
global?
all that regularly. When I do see it, the English language version, I think it's a pretty good operation. Do they have some of their biases? Yes, most people do. But I don't find it excessive, and I think they very often have stories that we don't have. But I want to go back to the basic question. That's another piece I wrote. This one for Foreign Affairs back again in the early 90s called Media Pervasiveness. And it tried to answer, or at least offer an opinion on that question. How much does media actually affect policymaking? And is that changing, diminishing, growing, or whatever? The basic, I'm oversimplify it a bit, but the basic finding I came up with, or position, was this: that media can have, and particularly pervasive media, 24 hours, 7, CNN, and so on, indeed can have an effect on tactics and on specific situations, but not much effect on the long-term making of policy, what its direction is going to be, what its intentions are. Let's take staying in the war. Everybody loves to say the United States is fickle, it's got a democratic public, it never wants to stay long in the war. We're 8 years into this one. We were 7 years into Vietnam. We were 4.5 in World War II and ready to go more if it took more. So much depends on whether the public thinks there is a good reason to be there or not. If they do, a democracy is no worse than another society and maybe better in making sacrifices. But when they lose the sense that there's a reason to be there, or the cost-benefit ratio has adversely changed, we're losing too many bodies, we're losing too much money, and we don't know why, or we can't explain it to a degree that justifies this, then you're in trouble. And that may be happening before we know it pretty soon with Afghanistan, where we've got some tight deadlines coming up. But I'll give you an example of affecting a tactic or a situation, but not the general policy. When we went to war against Iraq in the first place, and we got towards the end of this blitzkrieg success militarily, and there's this highway, which was ultimately labeled the highway of death from Kuwait all the way back to Baghdad, that was just loaded with Hussein armaments, tanks, trucks, and whatnot, fleeing. And for a while, because the war wasn't over, our planes were picking off each one of these vehicles, and the pictures on television were horrific of poor little soldiers running out of their tanks and whatnot else and getting down. And George Bush and Colin Powell together said, enough. We've won what we came to do under the mandate of the UN. We don't need these pictures on television, which are going to turn everybody against us. Now, that's not changing the direction of the war. That's not changing basic policy. It's changing the tactics of it. And it's a particularly egregious example, I suppose, but I could give you plenty of others. So we tend to overplay, particularly if we're on the losing end of an argument. We overplay the influence of media at that fundamental level of what does a nation do or not do. The oldest formulation that ultimately nations do what they do internationally for reasons of national interest, which is has far more deeper roots than media coverage, I think remains the case.
But do you think we still think that we have reason to be there?
In Afghanistan,
Did we ever?
the only thing and I'm going to go out on a limb on this one because I think it's really not quite clear at the moment, but the only thing I think that is going to keep us there is if Petraeus and McChrystal and others can maintain a sense that we are actually beginning to accomplish something, that there is success, at least with a small s. I think that's going to be hard to do, frankly. But outside of that, I don't see that there's a very good rationale for why we're still there. Let's take the original reason, which was we were attacked from there, and we were attacked by forces that were not necessarily Afghan. They were there by agreement of the Taliban, which was then running Afghanistan. But they were al-Qaeda terrorists. Most of them were from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and so on. Today, it's estimated that there is about 125 or less active al-Qaedans actually in Afghanistan. Now, the Al-Qaeda Command Center is right across the border in Pakistan, but it is also very much diminished. Its financial capabilities have been undermined. Its ability to stay put in some place and make large-term plans and to recruit people and to train them is very, very difficult. They're constantly on the run in one way or another. This does not mean they aren't still a threat, that they can't commit tragedies that we wish didn't happen. But as a truly existential threat, they're much, much less than they once were. And the biggest fear now of terrorism being a threat at that level is if they get nuclear capabilities. And that is one reason for the Obama thrust and for other people's thrust to try and get more control over nuclear fission material to start with, and then to intercept shipments wherever we find them of weapons or technologies or trained staffs from North Korea or Pakistan or wherever they're coming from. But I think the problem for Afghanistan, I should say, I think the deadline is, the summer of 2011. We are supposed to have retrained the police and the army and to be able to say goodbye, and everything's going to be not nice, it's not going to be Jeffersonian democracy, but it'll be stable, and it won't be the center of large-term threats against the rest of us. That's asking a lot in what's left between now and the summer of 2011. So what happens if we get to that deadline and we say, whoops, we got to stay a little longer? I think there's going to be a major debate on that. We'll be coming up to the 2012 election. We will, by that time, have cost figures for these two wars that's in the middle trillions, and in length will be by far the longest wars we've ever conducted. And I think we'll see a public pressure for cutting and running is a little overstatement, but for bringing it down faster and leaving them to their own devices sooner than otherwise would have been the case. So I guess my answer to you is I don't think we have a situation there where we have a democratic populace that's willing to back what they increasingly do not see the purpose of.
I mean, I have one last question. Given your comments about sort of the pervasiveness or the importance of media, so the attention, for example, that people gave to Ethan Bronner's position at the New York Times as the correspondent in Israel, was that justified, or was it over the top?
You got to be more specific. What particularly do you mean by it?
Well, there was the Ethan Bronner is the correspondent
Right.
of the Times. Do you think that the sort of controversy around it was it not so much necessary, but is it a necessary debate, or do you think people overreacted?
I'm just not sure what it is you're referring to. I guess I didn't follow it closely enough. What
Well, he's a
specifically?
correspondent
Yeah.
in Israel.
Yeah, but what is it specifically that he's done that?
The issue is that his
Raises
son
this
had
question.
joined the Israeli Defense Force. And so there were people who were clamoring about the fact that he should not be the correspondent in Israel. I'm just saying, if media is
Yeah.
not really that, I mean, maybe that's a stretch, I suppose.
No, I don't know,
Yeah.
when media becomes
Yeah.
part of the news, I mean,
Right,
it's
yeah.
another New York Times, remember when they received anthrax after September 11th, and they didn't know whether they should report it as a victim or as a news organization?
Right. Look, the media is a very large entity, and it stretches all the way from radio disc jockeys, and occasionally you want to have something to say about where we're going, to very highfalutin academics who also engage in media. So the idea that we're going to have a force that can be policed to the same standards all the time is just not practical, but it should be tried. And you get these situations coming up, and they're more serious than they may look on the surface because they undermine the credibility of everything else around them, not just the reporting from Israel, but it's the same thing happening somewhere else. So newspapers and other entities that want to consider themselves as important and serious journalistic outlets have got to be very tough when these things come up, and have to have internal standards that are, everybody understands and are applied. That doesn't mean there aren't going to be these exceptions, but when you come across them, you need to act with real vigor, because you're putting the whole operation at risk if you don't.
Well, thank you so much. It was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so I would like to open it up for questions, and I suggest maybe we can collect 3 questions and then answer all of them and then move on. Tara?
Great. Thank you. That was fascinating. Thanks. So I actually have 2 questions, and the first relates to your analysis around when the American public actually cares about foreign policy, and that it's about fear. And I would just ask you, in the context of the fact that these wars have been some of the longest running in our history, what role do you think not having a draft plays in that, right? In the sense that it's not just about fear, but also about how much it impacts you and your family and your community, especially when you have elites who, in particular, don't have their sons and daughters going off to war. So that's one question. I'll just start. The second one was I wanted to think back. You're in a really have an incredibly unique vantage point about the interplay between media and I guess I would call the legitimate scope of public debate and public policy making in this country, given your position at Foreign Affairs. And I want to just think back around the debate around the Iraq War and the WMDs and whether there were WMDs and whether there should or should not be an intervention. And in that context, looking backwards, those who were really critical or highly critical of the invasion were very left, considered very left, right, or very marginal in the scope of public discourse. And now it's obviously shifted quite significantly. And I was just as someone who was an actor in trying to oppose that invasion at the time, and critical of it, and feeling that my voice felt very, I'd say, sidelined and very left, and now would be considered quite mainstream and centrist. I would love to just hear your thinking about the role of media and public policy analysis and publications like Foreign Affairs in shaping the scope, the terrain of legitimate debate in this country.
Very good. Let me take, yes.
You want to answer this now?
That's a pretty big one, yeah.
Okay.
She's got several different questions in there. On the first one, you're absolutely right. Having a draft does make a difference. And from the Vietnam War, the University of Michigan did a study after we'd been fighting for 3-4 years on the shift in public opinion, and it directly related to the body count coming home, to the number of black bags that were coming in. And you could judge it by communities. Ones that were really up in arms paid the higher price. But I would tell you that that alone doesn't explain big shifts in public opinion. Let's take another democracy. Great Britain, and one of the very good examples of this was the Boer War, which they finally had to essentially quit for the same reason, which is the public was not willing to support it anymore. And there was only a volunteer army. There was no draft. The draft is important, but it doesn't alone explain or won't explain when the American public turns more against Afghanistan, which it will do if there isn't a fairly good case that we're making progress, that the progress is worth it, that we'll be safer, and that part of the region will be more stable with what we're doing. That's a tall order. I'm not sure that the cards are there for that. I want to amend my how the public gets energized or not. There has been a development in the American public, I think, in one regard, in soft power. We have become much more attuned to humanitarianism and to the use not only of our official organs of government, but NGOs around the world. And this should not be, not that you are, this should not be sniffed at. It's not the same thing as public backing or lack of backing on great strategic issues, but it is bloody important in terms of how we are viewed in the world and whether problems do or don't get resolved to some extent or not. On the second question, which was,
Which was long. It was on the people who opposed the war. And
Oh,
it
yes,
seemed on
right.
the fringe of the left, and now it's sort of
Acceptable
the
public
central.
yeah. I guess you're right that most people who initially opposed the war were either labeled as being very left in all their thinking, or I'll give you another category, who were very, very informed. And no, I don't mean that as, there was a lot of information which simply wasn't available to the public. Let me give you one, for example. I was against the war right from the beginning. Not that it maybe didn't need to be fought at some point, but I was against it because I knew, and others who were following it very closely knew, that the French under Chirac had come to us and said, look, you're going to war too soon. The inspectors are still out there. They are creating quite a record. Give us another 60 days, another 60 days, 2 months. Give us another 60 days. And if they complete this report and it's the same as it is now, we shouldn't be going to war. If it isn't, and we will go to war with you. We'll be your ally. And we had by that time so mobilized, that's one excuse, the other one was what was in George Bush's head, we refused to meet, and Cheney. We refused to wait. The French, they've never forgotten it, by the way. So, yes, those who were against it just on general propositions were for the most part considered left or center. And then there was a group of us who had some information that said, this is nuts. If we have to go to war, let's at least make sure we've got all the allies that we really need, and let's make sure that the inspectors have really told us that there's a reason to be going to war. The French were convinced that another 60 days, they would not give us reason to go to war. They would actually give us more reasons why we shouldn't go to war. But that's now history.
Okay, so we have 3 questions, and if you could please ask short questions, I would really appreciate it. Thank you. Sir?
Thanks, Mr. Hoge. You've arrayed out the balance of media and policy, and to some degree attempted to integrate the public into it. My concern as a citizen, however, is that we are a very, very uninformed public with respect to foreign affairs. We also are very concerned about the fact that every foreign initiative we get into, we borrow money to get into it. And I am wondering, from your perspective, has this changed the flashpoint of anger amongst the American people that will, in effect, change policy? Or are we the same benign, sleepy crowd that allowed ourselves to get into Vietnam, allowed ourselves to get into bomb Serbia, allowed ourselves with weapons of mass destruction, Afghanistan, Iraq? Are we the same quiet, somnolent crowd? Or has there been a change in the flashpoint, in your opinion? Thanks.
Can we wait?
Yeah, sure,
Is it
please.
okay? Thank you. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot of questions I could ask, so I'll pick one. One, in many countries in the global south and other places, there's this idea that the BRIC countries are developing towards a multipolar world. And this, obviously a reaction to, you could say unilateralism, if to put it nicely, which was taking place. So if you could just comment on this phenomena. There's 2 aspects to it. One is aspirational. The other is the empire really going to be challenged by something like this?
And this, you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the original question that you were asked about how you pick things as opposed to,
I forgot that one,
which,
yeah.
yes, that you've also got a colleague group, the Foreign Policy Association has great decisions, and they have to pick which are the chief areas. How do you go about actually thinking about what it is you want to educate people about? What is it that's important?
Is that it?
Yep.
Okay. Benign public, I think I might describe it slightly differently than that. Maybe it's a disengaged public, but it's more concerned than the label benign might suggest. Part of the public may be that way, but part of the public really is very concerned about what's going on in the world and what we are doing and whether we know what we're doing or not, are we making a positive contribution. On the question of proper debate and leadership for the public, there are two examples that stick in my head all the time these days. One is the Iraq War I, and the second is the Iraq War II. In Iraq War I, under George Bush I, there was a major congressional debate, and it was a rather informative and instructive one. And if you were paying attention, you came away as a public that knew more why we were doing what we were doing, and what the mandate was, and how clear it was. Go get them out of Kuwait, that's it. Second Iraq War, there was no great debate anywhere, particularly in the Congress. It was hatched in the Bush White House, and we mobilized forces to the point where we couldn't turn around before anybody was aware of it. And I hope we learned a lesson from that. And I think it also shows in public attitudes. The public attitude about Iraq War I was not, isn't this wonderful, we're going to war, but it was understandable. And it was, second Iraq War, right from the beginning, has been a fractious element in American political life. Not only the left of center, but very quickly the center on began to say, what the hell are we doing and why, and who's going to explain it to us in ways that we can feel justified at the money we're spending and the casualties that we're taking. And it's never happened. The only thing that's happened in Iraq that keeps us there is, quote, the surge and its supposed success, and the political argument that if you let Iraq deteriorate into a home for insurgents and terrorism and whatnot else, it'll affect the entire Middle East, and that will be a national interest problem for us, with all the oil we need from there, with the potentials of that growing even larger into some sort of world kind of conflict. On the second question, BRICS and Empire Challenge, the BRICS is a label that was put on those countries. They didn't come up with it, and that's the reason I mention that is because there really are, there's very little about them that is equal. Brazil is going to have to be separated out. It is growing so fast, and it's becoming such a hemispheric power of the future that you've got to consider them on their own terms, like we consider Russia on their own terms, or China. But the larger question, which is with these rising powers, the big ones identified and others coming up underneath them, is this really changing, are they having more effect in changing our imperial designs, if one wants to call it that? I would say two things are going on at the moment, and they are very much interrelated, and I think the Obama administration is trying to respond to both. The first is, yes, we are moving towards a multipolar world. We are not there. The Russians like to talk about we are there, and Russia's an equal multipolar power to us. It just isn't true. But we are moving in that direction, and that means a different kind of construct in which you operate. Concurrent with that is the absolute necessity to move towards multilateralism in addressing problems, because it's a host of what we call the global management problems that simply do not lend themselves to any one nation or entity resolving them. So you're going to have a lot more coordination than we have. I mean, just tick them off. Environmental, climate, terrorism, internationalized drugs, internationalized crime using all the major technologies. I could go on. These are issues that take all sorts of concerted efforts by regional groups, by international organizations, so forth and so on. In my opinion, Obama recognizes both these phenomena. And underneath the hot buttons that he's having to deal with, Israeli, Palestine, and Iran, and so on, these are very much on his mind. If you were to take his foreign policy, his approach to foreign policy in phases, the first phase when he came into office was to say, look, we can't get anything done. We can't get any multilateral cooperation as long as the rest of the world is as scared of us as they are and has us ranked up very high as the most hostile nation. So he first gave a set of speeches and meetings and groupings around the world, essentially to try and change very broad public attitudes about us. That phase is pretty much over. What he's into now is phase two, which is, okay, if you're going to get anything done, you've got to start getting to know and cooperate with, on a much more intimate day-to-day basis, with actual leaders, political leaders, regime leaders, and so on. And that's what we're up to now. So the The answer to your question is yes, we are moving towards a multipolar world, and we really ought to adjust to that because we can't change that. That's a tide that's very big. And as part of that, we have to find ways to have much more multilateral cooperation. And the tricky part of that is lots of places are not going to be cooperative with us if the international institutions, the UN, the G8, the Basel Accords, and all the rest of them are essentially designed for Western interests only, and in Western interests only, predominantly U.S. There's going to have to be a shift in who gets what part of the pie and who makes the decisions. And that's going to be the really tough part.
One more.
Well, we've got the question of how do we choose what to do?
Well, if you're an educator, how do you determine your curriculum?
Well, let me do it as a media person. My thought when I came into foreign affairs, as I say, 18 years ago now, we were quarterly then, was that we were very prestigious, but we were sitting on too many coffee tables unopened. And that one of the reasons for that was not enough attention was paid to making the material inside accessible to an informed and an educated public, but not a specialty public. So we have spent a lot more effort and time on getting very expert editors working for us and editing pieces far more than they used to be, getting rid of jargon, getting rid of repetition. The second thing we did, and it's one reason I went to 6 times a year, was to say you're not going to be able to get a public beyond specialists to pay attention to things that don't have some sense of consequence in their lives. So that what you want to do in the magazine is to kind of ride the tides as they are building. That's easy to do if you have frequency. Now, if you get too much frequency, you're competing with folks doing something that you weren't founded to do. There are monthly magazines, there are weekly magazines that are very intelligent, but the longer look, you can do one 6 times a year, but I've been asked to go monthly. A number of times I've said no. Maybe my successor, but no, I'm not going to do that. I like what we do. This is what our mandate was. The second thing about picking pieces, we do try to anticipate what's happening in the world. And sometimes we get it so right that it happens before we come out. And that hurts a bit, and sometimes we are so far ahead of the game that nobody pays attention. I'll give you the classic example from my history there. In the early 90s, I read about this fellow named bin Laden, and there were a few bombs here and there. They took out a boat and whatnot else. And I said, this guy seems to be up to something much bigger. And I think before it gets bigger, let's try and tell people who he is. And I got Bernard Lewis, who's a very well-known Arabist scholar at Princeton, to write a piece on who bin Laden was and what it was he was up to, and so on. I had a few very nice people, other specialists, who said, that's an interesting piece. Nothing much happened. Much later, 2001, 9/11 happens. We at the magazine immediately put on the general wire for use, no attribution, however you want to try and help the general press catch up, all the pieces we'd run during the 90s on the changing nature of terrorism, the changing capabilities which were grossly enlarged by technology, and this particular group that had globalized ambitions, not local political ones. And it was run by this extraordinary character named Osama bin Laden. Lewis, by that time, had retired as a professor. And he's in his backyard in Princeton, hoeing and whatnot else, and the phone begins to ring. And it didn't stop ringing for about 10 days or 2 weeks. And it was people responding to his piece that we had put on as part of this package in 2001. The next thing Bernard knows is he's invited down to the White House for briefings, to the State Department, the Pentagon, and whatnot else. And he's a very archy British sort. And he called me up in mock anger and said, I suppose I have you to thank for the fact that I have no private time left of my own. And at the moment, for a second, I thought, oh my God, he's really upset. And then I figured that he really was, and then I started laughing, and I said, You have a lot of time at the White House. Isn't that better than private time? But just to finish the answer to that, in addition to trying to catch things that are coming up, we do try and also gauge what's of real consequence and what's maybe just a passing fad that somebody else can deal with better than us. And sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. How do we get pieces? I would say about 80% of the magazine is commissioned in one way or another. It's either commissioned directly because I want something and I go through our network to see who I think would be right, or it comes through the network that I constantly am tapping into to say, what do you see, what are you concerned about, and so on. And so one of them may come up with a good suggestion that I will follow through with, either with them or with somebody else that we think might be better on the subject.
Okay, thank you. So we have a couple of questions. Michael, the lady in the first row, and then Mark.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your talk. Some of us spend a lot of time from here, spend a lot of time in Latin America. And one of the things I heard a couple of weeks ago in Buenos Aires was someone referring to Obama as Bush Light, L-I-T-E, meaning that there's not much change, that in fact Obama has ignored Latin America, that we've now in a period where there has been little attention to the issues that Latin American leaders are concerned about. And particularly, the question I have about foreign affairs is how you've sort of thought about the role of this new group of progressive leaders in Latin America who were elected from 2002 to 2009, and the observation that the U.S. really hasn't paid attention to the issues of inequality and poverty and understanding kind of the new policy orientation. Be interested in your take on that part.
Okay.
Yeah, since the beginning of time, there have been ideological and religious wars, and I'm just wondering how long you think this Islamic threat, real, imagined, exaggerated, will haunt our future, and what does it mean in terms of like surveillance? I mean, we have tremendous surveillance of the American public now. A lot of people are beginning to think it's like fascist surveillance, and also our bases all over the world. And where do we stand in this whole kind of triangle, very jumping line?
Vera and Mark.
On Afghanistan, to follow the media here is to understand that the end of the war is going to involve this kind of new surge that's going on now, and also training of government functions such as the police and the military. When you talk to people on the ground in Afghanistan and Pakistan, you understand that the end of the war doesn't happen without negotiating with the Taliban. So how do you bridge that divide?
Okay, let me start with Latin America. One of the constants, it's facetious and I'm sad about it, but one of the constants of American foreign policy is every administration from Jack Kennedy on comes in saying, we're going to pay attention to Latin America. They're our brothers and sisters, they're just south of us, and then nothing happens. Now, more happened under Bush, but nowhere near what he had promised when he came into office. One reason for this is presidents come into office and they determine that they have some really big time bombs sitting around, called Russia, called China, called the Middle East and whatnot else. They spend themselves, and then they get themselves engaged. We start fighting wars and whatnot else, and there's not much left over to apply to a pretty benign area from our point of view, from a security point of view. That's one reason it doesn't happen. Now, as to the progressive leaders and paying some attention to them, I'm not going to put ourselves forward as being too much better than the government, but we have had a series of Latin American pieces. We have another one coming up in the next issue. But we had one a while back when this new group of leaders came along by Hoge, the former foreign minister of Mexico. They essentially said there are two lefts in Latin America these days. There is the kind of Lulu left, which is more centrist, more identifiable by an American is what we mean by left. And then there is the Chavez, Bolivian, Ecuador kind of left, which is more radical, more sort of conjunctively anti-American, and both have to be dealt with, but we should encourage the first left, the Lulu sort of centrist left, as being the best for the future of the region. Bush Light also tells you that however inadequate his approach to the region was, it was better than what we're doing right now. And the Obama administration is, at the moment, just stretched so thin with both wars, the problems at home, financial, economic, and otherwise, that if you can ignore something, you're going to do it for a while. And the feeling is Latin America is one of those places, it's not going to blow up on you. It may not progress as fast as it should, but it isn't a deep and dangerous threat. So if you're overstretched, that's one place you can kind of take a pass. That's the way I read it.
Surveillance.
Ideological, religious, is it a growing phenomenon? And is it going to lead to even more surveillance and things of that sort in our societies?
Yeah, and also in our world, and
how Right.
does it affect the mindset of?
Yeah. In every major religion, there has been a growth over, let's say, 25, 30 years or so, of the fundamentalist wings of these religions, if you will. It's true in Judaism, it's certainly true in Christianity. Think of the evangelical, very conservative forces, particularly in the south of the United States. It's true in Hindu, the most passive of all general religions, which now has a very nationalistic wing. It's true of the Muslim world, where even in Asia, where there are far more Muslims than there are in the Middle East, Wahhabism has caught on, and Indonesia, all of these societies now have fundamentalist problems to deal with. So that tells us there's something going on kind of system-wide that's leading to this. I don't have the answer, but I would suggest that part of the answer is globalization. And as a part of globalization, the incredible increase in mobility, people moving, migratory patterns that are really quite large, and that all of this leads to a breakdown of people's surety in their identity, in the tribal identities they once had, or the local community identities they once had. A lot of it is, in their opinions, being run over roughshod, and they are left feeling very insecure. Then they look around for what can they attach themselves to in terms of identity politics, and religion is always there. And I think that is one reason that it is occurring. I would say this about it, however. Most of the fundamentalist drives that end up also creating insurgencies or terrorism, if you will, have local aims, and mostly they are political, even when they are dressed up as religious aims. And that is certainly a problem, but it is nowhere near the problem of the few groupings that have decided that their real aims are global, are ideological on a global scale. And that is at least a part of the fundamentalist Muslim movement that has got all of our attention, which is they want a worldwide caliphate if they ever get through with it. And so is it going to lead to more clampdown, surveillance, taking your shoes off at the airport and the rest of it? Yes, I think it is. England, for example, which is another democracy, is far ahead of us in terms of on-the-street surveillance. There is hardly a block in London where your picture is not being taken. Now, one thing this tells us, of course, is that surveillance itself is not what leads to totalitarianism. It's the use of it. And I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but as long as you've got a democracy and you've got some checks and balances and you've got some transparency to the tools that are being used, you can probably check most of the authoritarian drives that technology might lead you to. In other societies, it's not going to add to totalitarian or to authoritarianism because they're already there. But in this country, I would expect to see a continuing increase in surveillance until and such time as terrorism becomes a much more modest problem in the public's perception that has to be dealt with. And we're not there yet. I think that's it for the questions so far?
No.
No, what was the other one?
Afghanistan, Taliban.
Oh, Afghanistan, Taliban, excuse me. Let me reposition it a bit. It's been said that from our not too long experience with insurgencies, 50, 75 years at most, that one lesson we should have learned is that you can't prevail over them unless you have a strong local partner. We ended up not having a strong local partner in Vietnam, and there's a real question whether one can consider Karzai, no matter what clothes he's wearing this day, a strong partner. The amount of corruption, the amount of inefficiency, the amount of ineffectualness is of a very high order. But the judgment that apparently has been made is that there is no alternative to him. It has to be a Pashtun, that's the major demographic group, and within the Pashtuns, the potential candidates are all worse than he is. So it would appear that we have decided to cool the talk, the rhetoric. We decided to try to stop reforming him because it isn't working, and instead to find ways of cooperating with him and also going around him, which is what we did in the Philippines when Marcos turned out to be a local partner that was uncontrollable and was essentially wrecking the place. We started going around him. We started providing aid through different channels, through political support through different channels, and ultimately Marcos was overthrown. Not that I think we are looking to have Karzai overthrown anytime soon, but I see us putting much more emphasis now on building up provincial capabilities and not central government ones. I think we, to a certain extent, have given up on the fact that you can have a very effective central government in Afghanistan, except on one or two basic issues, maybe land use, maybe energy use, and things of that sort. Negotiating with the Taliban seems to be something that we have moved towards because we can't find a way around them. If you can't beat them, join them. And Taliban is a very loose phrase. It goes all the way from real ideological nutcases to local people who just say, hey, this is the better card to play because they're organized, because they provide benefits to our society, schools, and so forth and so on. And besides, we're not going to be able to get rid of them, so let's go along with them. That's the kind of Taliban force, which is partly tribal, much less so ideological, that it looks like we think we now need to try and get into cahoots with. Can you separate the two? Can you separate the Omar-type Taliban that wants to put a whole very rigid lifestyle screen over the entire country? Can you separate that from more pragmatic, not necessarily nicer, but more pragmatic Taliban forces, tribal leaders, warlords, and work with them to at least stabilize the country to the point where we can live? I don't know, but that seems to be the game we're playing. And I certainly wouldn't put myself up as having enough expertise to suggest that there is an alternative to that that makes any sense. Once again, if we want to leave reasonably soon, a matter of a year, 2 years, 3 years or so, we've got to build up much better forces locally to at least contain the violence in the region, the ability of the region to affect others. And if that is not just a retrained police force, which is highly problematic at the moment, a retrained army, which is the same, but also requires going back to understanding that Afghan is a place in which local forces, local leaders are the real game. Then we got to do it.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I will invite every one of you to stay a little longer, and Mr. Hoge agreed kindly to stay also a little longer. And I want to thank Vera very much for organizing that. This is our event for